Sojourner Truth was a woman born into slavery who became a powerful voice for freedom and equality. Sojourner Truth, one of America's most famous abolitionists and women's rights advocates, was born Isabella Baum-Free in Swartkill, Ulster County, New York around 1797. She came from nothing, owned as property from birth. Truth's physical presence was commanding, standing nearly 6 feet tall with a deep, resonant voice that could quiet any room. Her early years were marked by unspeakable hardship. She was born enslaved, the property of a Dutch-speaking family in rural New York. Young Isabella spoke only Dutch in her childhood, which would later cause her difficulties when she was sold to English-speaking masters. Then in 1806, when she was just 9 years old, she was torn from her mother's arms and sold at auction along with a flock of sheep for $100. The trauma of that separation would haunt her for the rest of her life. Isabella was sold several times during her youth, experiencing brutal treatment at the hands of various owners. She endured beatings and abuse that left scars on her body and soul. In 1815, she met and fell in love with an enslaved man named Robert from a neighboring farm, but his owner forbade their relationship and beat Robert severely when he tried to see her. Isabella never saw him again. Instead, around 1817, her owner arranged for her to marry an older enslaved man named Thomas, with whom she would have 5 children. The marriage was not born of love but of the cruel economics of slavery, where human beings were bred like livestock to increase their owner's wealth. Isabella worked in the fields and in the house, laboring without compensation, without freedom, without hope of a different life. But Isabella possessed an inner strength and a deep religious faith that sustained her through these dark years. She prayed constantly, finding solace in her conversations with God. She believed that God heard her prayers and would one day deliver her from bondage. That day came sooner than she expected, though not through divine intervention alone. In 1799, New York State had passed a gradual emancipation law, which promised freedom to enslaved people born before 1799 on July 4, 1827. Isabella's owner, John Dumont, had promised to free her 1 year early if she worked hard and behaved well. She did exactly that, but when the time came, Dumont broke his promise, claiming that an injury to her hand had reduced her productivity. Betrayed and furious, Isabella made a decision that would change her life forever. In 1826, just months before the emancipation law would free her anyway, she escaped. She took her infant daughter Sophia and walked away from the Dumont farm before dawn, leaving behind her husband and her other children. She found refuge with Isaac and Maria Van Wagen, a Quaker couple who opposed slavery. When Dumont came looking for her, Isaac Van Wagen paid him $25 for Isabella and immediately set her free. She took the name Isabella Van Wagen in gratitude to the couple who had helped her. But her trials were not over. She soon discovered that her 5-year-old son Peter had been illegally sold by Dumont to an Alabama slave owner, despite New York law forbidding such sales. Isabella Van Wagen did something almost unheard of for a black woman in 1828. She took a white man to court and won. With the help of Quaker friends, she sued for the return of her son and prevailed, becoming one of the first black women to win such a case against a white man in an American court. When Peter was returned to her, his back was covered with scars from beatings. The reunion was bittersweet, as years of separation and trauma had damaged their relationship. Isabella moved to New York City in 1829 with her 2 youngest children, seeking work and a new life. She found employment as a domestic servant and became involved with various religious movements that were sweeping through the city. She joined the Methodist Church and became known for her powerful prayers and her ability to sing hymns with extraordinary emotion. But she also fell in with a religious cult led by a man named Robert Matthews, who called himself Matthias and claimed to be a prophet. The cult lived communally and practiced beliefs that were considered bizarre and dangerous by mainstream society. When the community collapsed in scandal and violence, Isabella found herself caught up in accusations and legal troubles, though she was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. The experience left her disillusioned with organized religion, but not with God. Her faith remained strong, but she began to seek a more personal, direct relationship with the divine. On June 1, 1843, Isabella Van Wagen had a profound spiritual experience. She heard a voice calling her to leave the city and travel east, preaching the truth of God's word. She believed this was a divine command, and she obeyed without hesitation. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth, choosing a name that reflected her new mission. Sojourner meant traveler, and truth represented what she intended to speak. At the age of 46, with almost no money and no clear destination, she set out on foot from New York City. Sojourner Truth walked through Long Island and Connecticut, stopping at camp meetings and churches to preach. She spoke about her experiences in slavery, about her faith in God, and about the need for moral reformation in America. Her speeches were unlike anything people had heard before. She had no formal education and could neither read nor write, but she possessed a natural eloquence and a commanding presence that captivated audiences. Her voice was deep and powerful, and she sang hymns that moved people to tears. She quoted the Bible from memory, having learned scripture by having others read it to her. She was not a Thomas Jefferson or Frederick Douglass, any of the educated intellectuals who were leading the reform movements. She was something entirely different, a former slave woman who spoke with raw authenticity and moral authority. In late 1843, Sojourner Truth arrived at the Northampton Association of Education and Industry in Massachusetts, a utopian community dedicated to abolition and equality. There she met leading abolitionists including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and David Ruggles. These reformers recognized Truth's unique gifts and encouraged her to speak publicly against slavery. She began to travel the abolitionist lecture circuit, sharing the stage with famous speakers and telling her story to audiences throughout the North. Truth's speeches were powerful because they came from lived experience. She could describe the pain of being sold away from her mother, the agony of watching her son being beaten, the humiliation of being treated as property rather than a person. White audiences who might have dismissed slavery as an abstract political issue could not ignore the testimony of a woman who bore its scars. In 1850, Truth dictated her autobiography to a friend named Olive Gilbert. The narrative of Sojourner Truth was published and sold at her lectures, providing her with income to support herself. The book brought her story to an even wider audience and established her as one of the leading voices of the abolitionist movement. But Sojourner Truth was not content to fight only against slavery. She also became an advocate for women's rights, recognizing that women, like enslaved people, were denied basic human dignity and legal rights. In 1851, Truth attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, where she delivered what would become her most famous speech. The exact words she spoke that day are disputed, as different people recorded different versions, but the speech that became known as "Ain't I a Woman" electrified the audience. Truth challenged the prevailing notions that women were too delicate and fragile to vote or participate in public life. She pointed to her own strength and endurance, forged in the fires of slavery. She had plowed fields and gathered harvests and borne children who were sold away from her, and no man had ever helped her into carriages or lifted her over mud puddles. She demanded to know why, if she could do all these things, she should not have the same rights as any man. The speech was a powerful rebuke to both racism and sexism, delivered by a woman who embodied the intersection of both forms of oppression. Truth's feminism was not the genteel reform movement of middle-class white women. It was rooted in the harsh realities of being a black woman in America, subject to both racial and gender discrimination. Throughout the 1850s, Truth continued to travel and speak, facing hostile crowds and physical danger. She was sometimes attacked by mobs who opposed her message of abolition and equality. In Indiana, a group of men claimed she was actually a man in disguise and demanded that she expose her breasts to prove her sex. Truth responded with characteristic courage and dignity, shaming the men for their crudeness while making clear that her womanhood should not be in question. She survived on donations from supporters and sales of her book and photographs. She sold carts to visit, small photographic portraits, with the caption "I sell the shadow to support the substance," meaning she sold images of herself to support her actual body and her mission. These photographs spread her image across the country and helped make her one of the most recognizable figures of her time. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Truth saw it as the fulfillment of her prophecies. She had long believed that slavery could only be ended through divine judgment, and she interpreted the war as God's punishment on America for the sin of slavery. She worked to gather supplies for black volunteer regiments and spoke at rallies supporting the Union cause. In 1864, at the age of 67, Truth traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet President Abraham Lincoln. The meeting took place in October, just weeks before Lincoln's re-election. Truth presented Lincoln with a Bible from the colored people of Baltimore, and Lincoln signed her autograph book, Writing for Auntie Sojourner Truth. The meeting was brief but meaningful to Truth, who saw Lincoln as an instrument of God's will in ending slavery. After the war, Truth remained in Washington, working with the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. She was appointed to work at Freedmen's Hospital, where she counseled and assisted refugees who had fled to the capital seeking safety and opportunity. But Truth was appalled by the conditions she found in the refugee camps and the failure of the government to provide adequate support for the free people. She became convinced that the solution was to resettle freed slaves on public lands in the West, where they could own property and become self-sufficient farmers. She launched a petition campaign to Congress, traveling throughout the North collecting signatures and lobbying politicians. Though she gathered thousands of signatures, Congress never acted on her proposal. The failure of Reconstruction and the betrayal of promises made to freed people was a bitter disappointment to Truth in her final years. Truth returned to Michigan, where she had purchased a home in Battle Creek in 1857. She continued to speak occasionally on topics including prison reform, temperance, and the rights of freed people, but her health was declining. She suffered from ulcers on her legs that caused her great pain and limited her mobility. Still, she remained active in her community and received visitors from around the world who wanted to meet the famous Sojourner Truth. She was visited by reformers, journalists, and admirers who came to hear her stories and seek her wisdom. In her old age, Truth reflected on the changes she had witnessed in her lifetime. She had been born a slave in a nation that considered black people property, and she had lived to see slavery abolished and black men granted the right to vote. Yet she also saw how far America still had to travel toward true equality. The rights she had fought for were being rolled back during the backlash of the post-Reconstruction era. Violence against black Americans was increasing, and the promise of freedom was proving hollow for many. Truth never learned to read or write, despite attempts by friends to teach her in her later years. She said her mind was too busy with other things to focus on letters. Instead, she dictated her correspondence and relied on friends to read to her. Her illiteracy did not diminish her intelligence or her impact. She possessed a sharp mind and a remarkable memory, and her speeches demonstrated sophisticated understanding of politics, religion, and human nature. She used humor, biblical references, and personal testimony to make complex arguments accessible to ordinary people. On November 26, 1883, Sojourner Truth died at her home in Battle Creek, Michigan. She was approximately 86 years old, though her exact age was uncertain because records of enslaved births were rarely kept. She was surrounded by friends and family, and her funeral was one of the largest ever held in Battle Creek. Thousands of people, black and white, came to pay their respects to the woman who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. When she died, she left behind a legacy that transcended her own life. She had inspired countless people to join the fights against slavery and for women's rights. She had demonstrated that moral authority came not from education or social position but from integrity and courage. Sojourner Truth was even in death a unifying figure, though not in the way George Washington had been. Washington unified a nation of free white men by establishing the precedent of peaceful transfer of power. Truth unified the movements for abolition and women's rights by insisting that freedom was indivisible, that no one could be truly free while others remained in bondage. Her legacy lived on in the continuing struggles for civil rights and equality. In the 20th century, Truth became an icon for multiple movements. Feminists claimed her as a pioneer of women's liberation. Civil rights activists honored her as an early freedom fighter. Her image appeared on postage stamps and in textbooks, though often sanitized and simplified. The real Sojourner Truth was more complex and more radical than the symbol she became. She was a woman of deep contradictions. She was deeply religious yet critical of churches that supported slavery. She was illiterate yet intellectually formidable. She advocated non-violence yet supported the Union Army's war against the Confederacy. She believed in racial uplift and self-help yet also demanded that the government provide reparations to freed slaves in the form of land grants. She worked within the system, petitioning Congress and meeting with presidents, yet she also fundamentally challenged that system by insisting that it recognized the full humanity of black people and women. Truth's life spanned nearly the entire 19th century, from the early years of the Republic through Reconstruction. She witnessed and participated in the most important social movements of her era. She was not a behind-the-scenes organizer or a writer of manifestos. She was a public speaker and a living witness, using her voice and her presence to challenge injustice wherever she found it. Her speeches were not carefully crafted essays but spontaneous performances, mixing humor and pathos, scripture and personal testimony, challenge and inspiration. No two speeches were exactly alike, as she adapted her message to each audience and occasion. This makes it difficult for historians to capture the full impact of her oratory, since we have only fragmentary and often unreliable records of what she actually said. What we do know is that she moved people, that she changed minds, that she inspired action. She made slavery and women's oppression real and immediate to audiences who might otherwise have remained indifferent. She forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about American society and about themselves. Sojourner Truth never held political office or commanded armies or accumulated wealth. She died with little money and few possessions. But she wielded influence through the force of her personality and the power of her words. She showed that even the most marginalized people could make their voices heard and could shape history. Her life was a testament to human resilience and dignity. She survived the worst that slavery could inflict and emerged not broken but strengthened, not bitter but determined to prevent others from suffering as she had. She transformed her pain into purpose and her suffering into a call for justice. In doing so, she became one of the most important figures in American history, a woman whose influence extended far beyond her own time. The lessons of Sojourner Truth's life remain relevant today. Her insistence that different forms of oppression are interconnected, that racism and sexism must be fought together, anticipates modern intersectional feminism. Her advocacy for economic justice and land redistribution speaks to ongoing debates about reparations and wealth inequality. Her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths to power provides a model for contemporary activists. Most fundamentally, her life demonstrates that ordinary people, even those born into the most oppressive circumstances, can become agents of historical change. Sojourner Truth was not born to privilege or power. She had every disadvantage that American society could impose. Yet she refused to accept the limitations others placed on her, and she dedicated her life to expanding freedom for everyone. That is why we remember her, why we study her, why her story continues to inspire new generations of people fighting for justice and equality in their own times.